The answer for any large, complex metropolis is good mass transportation. Mass transportation can help relieve highways, better service air travel, and tie together the entire region with a logical system. That's where the Metropolitan Transportation Authority comes into the picture.
So the New York City subway system really comes to life around the turn of the century, so 1894, 1900, around then. And the reason for it was obviously that it was necessary and that the technology was available. One of the things about New York City is that it characteristically grew more and more north. And as the population increased, more people were living uptown, and eventually more people were living even in the Bronx. And with the new immigrant population and with the development of new manufacturing, it became necessary to make it possible for people to get to work. And so the subway system clearly served that need, especially for working class people who had no other way of getting back and forth. And we don't yet have massive automobile or bus traffic in the way that we do now. It was inexpensive. It was possible for everybody to use it, and it's part of, I guess what we could call as a kind of democratic impulse around the turn of the century. So yes, the transit system was and still is used by everybody. Robert Moses begins to come to power in the 1920s, really comes into his own in the 1930s when LaGuardia is mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia is mayor of New York City. For both of them, the definition of what it meant to be a modern city was essentially a city that made use of the automobile. And so when FDR poured massive amounts of money through the New Deal into New York City, which had been devastated by the Depression, a lot of that money was turned over to Robert Moses. And clearly, rather than focusing on the transit system or on the subway or buses, public transit, his focus was really on the development of a highway system that would connect all of the boroughs and that would be obviously focused on the automobile. And essentially that's what he did. And that clearly meant that there was the deterioration of public facilities by the 1930s, and it continued apace. And it was part of a kind of starving of working class neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods as well. So Moses's vision of the city was a very different one than the vision that had been important and popular earlier in the century.
MTA. That wouldn't be the Metropolitan Transit Authority, would it?
It would. Can I ask you what you think of the Metropolitan Transit Authority?
I think they're lousy.
Got tons of buses. I mean, every avenue has a bus. All the major cross streets have buses, and then the subways pretty much cover the entire Upper East Side. So you can get anywhere to the Upper East Side really easily with the buses or subways. The only complaint I'd have is, the system's old and it needs a massive upgrade. And so they still use equipment that dates back 100 years. I mean, it's old stuff. And so it all needs to be upgraded. And I think that's part of the capital plan. But in the grand scheme of things, I can't complain. I mean, there are people who have much worse access or no access to the subway system or to the buses. And they've got to walk like, blocks or a mile. I know people who live out in Queens who have to walk a bit or even get dropped off just to get on the system. So I just literally, the most I have to walk is like a block, 2 blocks. I mean, so I can't complain.
There are no subway lines like 10 to 15 minutes from my house by car. Like I can't, unless I take the LIRR, which is like a special type of train. There are like buses that can take you to the 7 train in Flushing, but that takes like 20 minutes from my house to get there. So like I would not take the 7 train if I had to. Like, yeah, it's not really a choice. I've been taking New York City public transit for like years, since like I was little. So it's something that I've like grown up taking, grown up knowing, and so I'm like used to it. But recently there have been various like issues that have been coming up, um, like socioeconomic issues and racial issues in regards to like where people can access public transit, and like who's being treated differently depending on what type of like transit that you use, like, and where you're taking it. And I feel like those issues just, I mean, it's crazy that we haven't really thought about those things until now. Like, I feel like we've just kind of been ignoring it, but it's there. Like in my neighborhood, people that can't afford to take the LIRR, they can't go to schools like in Brooklyn like I do. So it's like, it's very much like a race and socioeconomic issue, I think, like where the people that are rich and wealthy, and oftentimes white, get everything. Yeah, and then everyone else is just left to like figure it out for themselves or like fight for their own rights.
This could be good news. Decades in the making, it's starting to look like we are getting closer to the second phase of the 2nd Avenue subway project. These tunnels have been around since the 70s, but soon they could take people into East Harlem.
The MTA's large-scale expansion projects focus on adding capacity to the system, expanding the reach of the network, and serving changing travel patterns throughout the region. New stations and increased service will support local land use and economic development strategies, revitalizing the region through new job opportunities, more housing, and increased mobility. Additional travel options make the region more resilient and able to better respond to disruptions and emergencies. With regards to 2nd Avenue Subway Phase 2, the project will extend service north from 96th Street to 125th Street, with 2 new stations on 2nd Avenue at 106th and 116th Streets, and another one at 125th Street between Park and Lexington Avenues. Phase 2 of the 2nd Avenue subway is long overdue for the residents and businesses of East Harlem. This area has been a transit desert ever since the 2nd and 3rd Avenue Ls were demolished decades ago. East Harlem is the most transit-dependent New York City neighborhood, with over 70% of residents relying on public transportation. It also has high rates of poverty and one of the largest concentrations of rent-regulated public housing in New York City. This project will provide much-needed access for jobs, education, and healthcare. In addition to the benefits for Harlem residents, Phase 2 will also reduce crowding and improve reliability along the Lexington Avenue line, the busiest transit line in America.
An effort is being made to make life a little better for everyone. An effort that will make some sense out of transportation, because transportation is our lifeline. What is done in the future depends on how easily this metropolis can be kept in motion. For all of us, not as a mass, but as millions of individuals with individual tastes and hopes and needs and dignity.